Okay, welcome back. With our next topic, it's unfortunately a pretty sad one. As we all know by now, this past weekend there were two tragic mass shootings in Dayton, Ohio, and in El Paso, Texas. And it's not even a week later, and people are really debating some of the causes and some of the motivations behind these shootings. So before we dive into the issues of white supremacy and President Trump and guns, I wanted to go through some of the other issues that politicians and people are blaming. First off is President Trump suggesting violent video games are one contributing factor.
Second, we must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. It is too easy today for troubled youth to surround themselves with a culture that celebrates violence.
Then Senator Elizabeth Warren suggested Fox News is at fault. In a quote retweet where someone is blaming Fox News for the shooting, she said, quote, "We need to call it out. Fox News is a hate-for-profit machine that gives a megaphone to racists and conspiracists." California Governor Gavin Newsom suggested it's toxic masculinity. He said, quote, "And I think that it goes deep to the issue of how we raise our boys to be men, goes deeply to values that we tend to hold near, power, dominance, and aggression over empathy, care, collaboration. And according to the Huffington Post, quote, that is a deeper conversation, forgive me, a more difficult one to have, but I just wanted to introduce this into the debate." And I think very interestingly, Suzanne Vanker put the blame on diminished roles of fathers in our society in an op-ed for Fox News. She wrote, quote, "I can vouch for this as the mother of a 15-year-old son who would not be the exceptional young man he is if not for his father. The truth is, I take very little credit for who my son has become. He needed me the most when he was little, but once he became aware of his male identity, it was his father, not me, he looked to for guidance and direction. His father was and remains his model for manhood." Continuing the quote, "When boys don't have this model, they suffer. And when they suffer, society suffers. A majority of school shooters come from a fatherless home, and a study of older male shooters, they use the name of the Las Vegas shooter, produces similar results. Indeed, the consequences of fatherlessness are simply staggering." What do you guys think?
So this is something that we've been studying and trying to understand here at Heritage for quite some time now. And I think all of this, all of these different, proposed underlying factors are all kind of missing this broader point. I think it's indicative of this tendency we all have to take a very complex problem and try to simplify it and distill it down to here is the one thing that's wrong, and if we can just fix this, we'll fix everything. Unfortunately, mass public shootings, just like gun violence generally, are a very complex problem that can't be explained by just one or two factors. That being said, there are several factors that are important, that we know are important, that we know have statistical relationships to mass public shootings and the people who commit them. And I think some of that was brought up in the context of some of the sound bites you just played. Certainly I don't think Fox News is to blame for anything or CNN is to blame for anything. But there is a context in which some of the rhetoric, our societal rhetoric, our societal glorification of violence does play a role in fostering within certain young individuals, especially young men, a feeling of isolation, a feeling of anger, a sense of purposelessness that you really see in most of these mass public shooters, even though there isn't like a specific connection between violent video games and mass public shooters. That general idea of glorification of violence certainly does not help, and the idea of fatherlessness, of broken homes, of the way that really affects people's upbringing and their sense of purpose, their sense of community, their ability to really understand themselves. It does play a role, but the reality is much more complicated than just one or two of those factors. It's a bigger problem that is more complex than that.
That's one of the things that I find frustrating in the media aftermath of a mass shooting. We see people rushing to blame all these different things when really there are so many contributing factors that all need to be looked at individually and then as a whole. So Lauren and I happened to be down in Florida working on a story about the Parkland school shooting when we learned about these mass shootings over the weekend. And you might think, what are you doing down in Parkland a year and a half later? Aren't you guys a little late to the story there? Actually, I'd say we're right on time. So information every day is still coming out about the shooter, about the school system that failed him, about his mental health, about the police response. There's actually a great book coming out by Max Eden and Andy Polak. Andy is the father of Meadow Polak, one of the students who was slaughtered in that school. And they got new information that we didn't know that contributed to this shooting that I would say is one of the most preventable mass shootings in history. It really angers you reading this book. It comes out in September, and we'll certainly be talking about it and sharing more about it on this podcast once it is available to the public. But that's what I wanted to ask you about, Amy. Like, what is a productive way to respond? Because I guess you don't want to say nothing, but I actually made a conscious decision not to go on Twitter immediately after and call for a specific solution or blame a certain thing, because in my time covering these issues and talking to you, I've learned that there is not just one thing we can magically do to fix this.
Well, one of the things that I think we have to start with is, again, that broader background and that context of who are the types of individuals, who are perpetrating these, what do we know about them? I mean, there are some very consistent themes. It is very, very rarely the case that individuals who commit mass public shootings had no red flags or concerning warning signs in their background. These are, by and large, not individuals who are mentally and emotionally well, who are in a stable place in life. Whether that's because they come from broken homes or because they're dealing with other sorts of deeper mental issues, or because as a result of stress in their life, or even just, a lack of pushback, or for whatever, they're falling in line with dangerous ideologies like what we saw in El Paso. We're seeing people who are broken human beings, predominantly young white men who are showing all of these warning signs. And so again, we know that factors of mental health play a role. We know that factors just associated with that sense of isolation and sometimes with connection to violent ideologies play a role. And so we have to start with that context of these are not people who are just popping up out of the blue, that we have no idea this is happening. These are by and large people that are the exact types of people that when this happens, they're like, oh, I bet it was this guy, because like we've been saying for a long time, he's capable of doing this. And so starting with this reality of, not to say that we can play Minority Report and predict who's going to commit crimes, but we're seeing consistent patterns of people who are well known to fall into this category and be a risk of dangerousness. And it's not until after they've already committed that horrific act that we're like, oh yeah, like this was, we saw this all along and just didn't do anything. Because once we understand that, we can start looking at, well, how do we then, in a legal context, narrow this down and identify these people and not just disarm them, though that is very important, but then also then direct them to places that are going to help them as human beings. Because I don't think anybody should sit here and go, yeah, it's sufficient to just have a bunch of broken individuals who don't have guns. But we should be saying, we want to fix these people. We want to help them. We want to make them whole, because that's what's going ultimately to make our communities, our schools, our families safer.
And Amy, I wanted to ask you more about the white supremacist component of the El Paso shooting. This man was disgusting in every way, of the way that he wanted to target, specifically Hispanic people in this shooting. But how big of an issue is these white supremacist shootings? And is white supremacy really on the rise, the way that the media makes it sound?
Well, I'll say this. So first and foremost, it's very clear that the El Paso shooter was driven by a specific ideology that is abhorrent, that would violently attack people on the basis of race and national origin. And that's abhorrent. It should be condemned. And by all means, we should treat it for the thing that it is, which is domestic terrorism. That being said, so it's not that's actually a very small percentage of mass public shooters who are fundamentally driven by an ideology, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's Islamic fundamentalism, or whether it's some other sort of coherent ideology that's driving people. Though sometimes what you'll also see is people who are just kind of mentally unstable, who are grasping onto ideologies and not really figuring, where it's not necessarily driving them, but it's not helping the case either. But that is actually a quite small percentage of all mass public shootings, which in and of themselves are a very small percentage of the problem of gun violence overall. So I'd say, yes, it is a problem. It is something that presents a danger to the public when you have people who are adhering to violent ideologies that want, that drive them to commit violent acts. And it is something that clearly we've seen. Like, this isn't an isolated incident. This is something that has a bit of a pattern to it, where, this being an MO of people who espouse violent rhetoric, if you will. But to take it that next step, as I think some pundits have, and say, oh, well, that means that white men are the biggest threat to American society. It's abhorrent to categorize all white men on the basis of what a couple individuals are doing, just as it is to categorize all Muslims by what some Muslims have done in the name of Islam. But it also misses just the broader context of the scope of the gun violence problem and what is actually driving most gun deaths and what the entire context of threats to the United States encompasses. So just this broad over categorization of white men that is actually dangerous in and of itself, because it makes it seem as though mass shootings and this very specific type of mass public shootings are happening left, right, and center, and it's something we all need to fear every time we walk out the door. And that's actually not going to be the most, by far, not even close to the most common interaction that people have with gun violence. It's actually suicide. You are much, much more likely to have your interaction with gun violence be the suicide either of yourself or someone you love than to experience a mass shooting, much less to experience violence from a white supremacist. So we need to keep that in context.
Highlighting the ugly side of the reaction to these mass shootings, the media pretty clearly doesn't like the president because some of them think he is actually a racist or white supremacist, or is enabling and encouraging racists and white supremacists. After these shootings, the president very firmly came out and made his views on white supremacy very clear. Here's a quick clip.
The shooter in El Paso posted a manifesto online consumed by racist hate. In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. These sinister ideologies must be defeated. Hate has no place in America. Hatred warps the mind, ravages the heart, and devours the soul.
So, Amy, I'm going to ask you about this, but in my opinion, President Trump said all the right things in this press conference, a clip of which you just heard. But when the New York Times reported on that exact speech, it did so with a headline that originally read, "Trump urges unity versus racism." People on the left quickly decided they had a huge problem with this, and the New York Times apparently agreed, amending the headline to say assailing hate but not guns. So the executive editor of the New York Times said the headline was written on deadline, and they quickly changed it after realizing it was a, quote, bad headline. A lot of us thought that was very interesting because the original headline reported on what the president said. He urged unity in the face of these tragedies, and he condemned these forms of racism, all racism. Apparently, news stories these days are supposed to be about what a person didn't say. No, they did, because the president in that speech did not call for gun control. People had a problem with it. So this was so frustrating because in that speech, it appeared that Trump said everything that everyone on both sides of this debate wanted him to say. But they didn't believe it, it appears, and they don't want the New York Times reporting simply on basic facts of the president's response to these shootings.
This, to me, is indicative of sort of a broader, more general problem we have of politicizing these sorts of tragedies immediately, where it's not about what actually happened. It's not about what was actually said. It's about how can this somehow further my political agenda, which in this case is almost always gun control and or bashing Republicans and or, throwing around that someone's responsible for the blood of children who wasn't anywhere close to committing the atrocity. And it's detrimental to the entire conversation, because when you have this mindset of, I don't care what you said, it's going to be wrong. Whatever you say is going to be wrong. We're seeing this even with regard to mental health. I mean, so it's not just with regard to the president not being able to say anything. I mean, he flatly condemned white supremacy, and it wasn't enough somehow. So somehow he didn't actually do that. But we're seeing this with people saying, oh, well, mental health has nothing to do with gun violence, which is laughable to anyone who looks at the statistics of this and sees the tremendous relationship between serious untreated mental health problems and not just mass public shootings, but also suicides, which are statistically a much bigger part of the problem. And now all of a sudden, it's we can't say mental health is related to it because that gives us an easy solution that we don't like because it doesn't have to do with guns. So much of this, so much of the rhetoric and the response to all aspects of this is being driven by an underlying concern for furthering a policy that people want and making this political. And it's just making our inability to really have meaningful discussions worse. It's fostering an environment in which it's impossible to find those complex answers to complex problems because everything has to be a simple solution that somehow furthers my preferred policy point.
Well, speaking of complex solutions to these complex problems, I wanted to ask you a twofold question. Would any type of gun control fix these problems? And what are these red flag laws that we have heard actually some Republican lawmakers start proposing?
Well, so in terms of what I would consider commonly proposed gun control measures, things like universal background checks or raising the age of purchase, banning, quote, so-called assault weapons, which really have no meaning. Again, because people are so unwilling to look at a lot of the underlying causes and the reality of what's happening with these mass public shootings, they're coming up with solutions that aren't tailored to actually prevent anything bad from happening. So take universal background checks, for example. All of these shooters would have passed universal background checks. And in fact, most of them do. Like they go through official stores and are able to purchase them and pass background checks because they know that they can, which kind of brings us into our next that next part about red flag laws. So most mass public shooters don't have disqualifying criminal records or mental health histories. And that's why they're able to pass background checks. So expanding background checks, it's like, okay, it does nothing because they're still going to get the guns. And what the basic concept of a red flag law is to say, look, there are certain individuals who we know, this specific type of individual who keeps committing these mass public shootings who haven't yet committed a crime or been convicted of a crime or haven't yet reached a point where they've been committed to a mental health institution because it just hasn't gotten that bad. But everyone is concerned about their behavior for objective reasons that are very clear. But our laws aren't tailored in a way to catch that. And red flag laws say, okay, how do we sort of expand the scope of what we're defining as dangerousness? So how do we identify and disarm individuals who we know are just objectively by their actions dangerous, but aren't yet disqualified from owning guns? And so red flag laws try to capture that by broadening what it means to be dangerous and then disarming those individuals after some form of due process and disarming them only for the amount of time that they continue to be dangerous. And so that's kind of the basic gist of them.
A lot of conservatives have concerns when there's any law brought against the Second Amendment. Dana Lash came out with an article this week. So what would you say to those critics?
I'll start off by saying I haven't read the Dana Lash article, so I'm not going to respond specifically to that. But generally, there are legitimate concerns that are brought up. I mean, these are not people who are off their rockers. These are people with very legitimate concerns about due process. I mean, we are talking about infringing fully, completely stripping someone of their Second Amendment right, even temporarily. And this is someone who hasn't yet been convicted of a crime. And so that's a big deal. That being said, so first of all, from more of a philosophical context, right, the Second Amendment right protects the rights of people who are peaceable citizens. Right? So there's a reason we restrict the Second Amendment rights of people who have been convicted of violent crimes or who are in a mental institution, because they're a danger to the public. And so basically all this is doing, again, is sort of expanding, there are many ways someone can be an objective danger to the public. But so how do we address those concerns? And part of that has to do with, again, ensuring adequate measures of due process that are equivalent to those we'd see, like if someone were to be committed to a mental institution. And then not just talking about due process, but also talking about the temporary nature of these restrictions. Because one of the purposes of this is to avoid sort of imposing substantial, like lifelong burdens on people, but rather just temporarily disarming them and pointing them in the direction of treatment and getting healthy, and then being able to restore those rights to them. And so there are actually people who say, well, why don't we just expand the scope of existing laws we have? And I say that's exactly the purpose of red flag laws. You can use whatever sort of context you want for this, but the reality is, that there are people who are objectively dangerous that can and should be disarmed temporarily. But we should be restoring their rights. We should be ensuring due process. And the other thing too is that what this does is it expands the people, the types of people who can petition the government. So like what we saw in Parkland, for example, is we had so many opportunities for people in positions of authority to do something, and they never did. So red flag laws kind of open that door for family members, particularly, to petition a court and say, look, no one's doing anything. This person is dangerous, and then to have a court hearing over it. But again, I understand those concerns. I'd say there are great resources available. Some states have done this really well. Some states have done it not so well, of ensuring that there is meaningful due process, that we have processes in place to ensure that people aren't just harassing people, that, and also to say that these have to be objective factors, right? Because the last thing we want is to have some sort of squishy definition of dangerous, where suddenly anyone who's ever worn a MAGA hat is considered dangerous because Donald Trump is a racist, and therefore, like, clearly you're dangerous and deranged. But to specifically define those factors that we know are objectively setting people apart as dangerous, and I think it's a concept that most people, if you ask them, they will agree on that concept of there are dangerous people who need to be disarmed. It becomes a question of how do we do that? And you can call it whatever you like. You can call it red flag laws. You can call it, better utilizing the systems we already have in place. But we have to acknowledge that. And I think we all do. It's just a matter of figuring out how do we do that in a way that isn't wrongfully infringing on the rights of people who are not dangerous.
We could and should talk about this issue all day, but we do have to wrap up this segment. Before we do that, I know your work isn't just focused on the Second Amendment. You've looked into mental health and other areas. For those who do want to be a productive part of this conversation regarding mass shootings, do you have any specific papers or areas that might be worth digging into that the mainstream media isn't necessarily telling us about?
Well, definitely just in the last couple months, my colleague John Malcolm and I have released a series of 3 papers looking at the interaction of mental illness, especially untreated mental illness and gun violence, and so kind of exploring that and how we got to what is really sort of a mental health crisis in this country, but then also what do good policies look like? So especially if you're interested in good policies surrounding red flag laws and mental health laws, look at these papers. Look at the series of papers. They go in depth about particular safeguards that are good in terms of red flag laws, and I would just really recommend those.
Thank you, Amy. That was just a really thoughtful and interesting discussion. We just really appreciate you coming on the program. And also this week you were on the Daily Signal podcast. So I want to give a plug for that. It's a daily podcast where you get to hear from experts like Amy, heritage experts, just lots of different people from throughout the conservative movement. And also they give you some news, they give you some headlines. So if you enjoyed this interview with Amy, I really would recommend that you check it out. It's daily, it's not weekly like Problematic Women. You can find that on SoundCloud, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're going to take a quick break.